Hi, I'm Lauren Lemongelli, book review publicist and event coordinator. I am thrilled to be back here with you all tonight for episode 2 of Write America, featuring two fabulous writers, Francine Prose and Paul Muldoon. So if you missed the kickoff to Write America last week with readings and a discussion from Poets Laureate Rita Dove and Billy Collins, you can go back to Book Review's Crowdcast channel and watch the recording at any time. This event is also being recorded, so feel free to share it with anyone who couldn't make it live tonight. I'll drop the link for last week's episode with Rita and Billy in the chat once we get underway with the readings. So before we start, I'd like to give you all a little tour around Crowdcast, just in case this is your first time here with us. There is a button right down here below the stream. If you click that button, it'll bring you right to our website, bookreview.com, where you can buy signed editions of some of Francine Prose and Paul Muldoon's books. There is a button down here, I think over here somewhere, that says Ask a Question. That is where you can submit a question for Francine and Paul during the event. And I see that some of you have found the chat. I think it's over here. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves, make comments, but just keep it nice. Now, without further ado, let's welcome our first writer to the screen. Paul Muldoon is a former radio and television producer for the BBC in Belfast and has taught at Princeton University for more than 30 years. He is the author of 14 collections of poetry, including Howdy Skelp, due from FSG and Faber & Faber in 2021. Among his awards are the Eric Gregory Award, the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Irish Times Poetry Prize, the 2003 Pulitzer Prize, and the Griffin International Prize for Poetry, to name a few. He has many more. He is a fellow of the Royal Society for Literature and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So let's welcome Paul to the screen for a reading. Hi, Paul.
Hello, how are you? Thank you so
much.
Much.
Thank you for being here today. I am going to let you take it away.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be here with Francine Prose. I'm going to read for about 15 minutes. I read a couple of poems set back in Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is where I'm from. And this first one is set in the school that I went to, the grade school or primary school, where my mother was one of the teachers. And that meant, of course, that I went along to school with her in the morning. But there were kids in the vicinity who hardly ever showed up for school. And this is a poem about one of them, about his life then and more recently. So it's called Anshaw, the title of which will become clear very soon. Anshaw. When the master was calling the roll at the primary school in College Lands, you were meant to call back Anshaw and raise your hand as your name occurred. Anshaw meaning here and now, all present and correct, was the first word of Irish I spoke. The last name on the ledger belonged to Joseph Mary Plunkett Ward and was followed, as often as not, by silence, knowing looks, a nod and a wink, the master's droll, and where's our little ward of court? I remember the first time he came back, the master had sent him out along the hedges to weigh up for himself and cut a stick with which he would be beaten. After a while, nothing was spoken. He would arrive as a matter of course with an ash plant, a sally rod, or finally the hazel wand he had whittled down to a whip lash, its twist of red and yellow lacquers, sanded and polished, and altogether so delicately wrought that he had engraved his initials on it. I last met Joseph Mary Plunkett Ward in a pub just over the Irish border. He was living in the open, in a secret camp on the other side of the mountain. He was fighting for Ireland, making things happen. And he told me, Joe Ward, of how he had risen through the ranks to quartermaster, commandant, how every morning at parade his volunteers would call back Anshaw and raise their hands as their names occurred. And another poem from that era, these were written back in the 1980s, pardon me, but the scene that's described here actually happened back in the 1950s when I was a kid. And it's a family story about the local auxiliary police force in Northern Ireland, the B Specials, the 2nd Division of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. They were banned, defunded, and taken out of business for their bad behaviour on the streets, and particularly their attitude to Catholics like myself. So anyway, it's called the Sight Seers. I mention the sash my father wore, which is one of the great songs of the Orange Order, the followers of Prince William of Orange and Nassau. The Sight Seers. My father and mother, my brother and sister, and I, with Uncle Pat, our dour, best loved uncle, had set out that Sunday afternoon in July in his broken down Ford, not to visit some graveyard. One died of shingles, one of fever, another's knees turned to jelly. But the brand new roundabout at Ballygawley, the first in mid-Ulster. Uncle Pat was telling us how the B Specials had stopped him one night somewhere near Ballygawley and smashed his bicycle and made him sing the sash and curse the Pope of Rome. They held a pistol so hard against his forehead, there was still the mark of an O when he got home. So I leave Northern Ireland, a couple of political poems there, and step right up to the moment here in this country. And I found myself, and I really did find myself over the course of a couple of weeks in June, working on a version of Aristophanes' The Frogs, the way one does in a couple of weeks in June. It's written as a rock musical. It features Dionysus, a rock god, Hercules, a guitar hero. It features the Real Housewives of Hades, of course. It features Chuck Berry, and it features Little Richard. If you recall, The Frogs has to do with a journey back to Hades to get in the case of the original, to get a major playwright to come back to Athens to help them recover from the dearth of high art or decent art. In this case, they're sending into Hades for someone who's going to save them from the dearth of great rock and roll. And one of the people they come upon is Little Richard. And this is a piece now with a combination, if one may allow such a thing, of slapstick, which of course is meat and drink to Aristophanes, and social justice, which needs to be meat and drink for us. So this is Little Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to talk about Little Richard. I'm here to talk about Little Rayshard. Rayshard Brooks was 27 when he was shot, same age as Amy Winehouse when she was caught in her own crossfire, same age as Jim Morrison, same age as Jimi Hendrix. I'm sure you know Jimmy was in my band long before he upped sticks for London. same age as Janis Joplin when her life went down the drain, same age as Brian Jones, same age as Kurt Cobain. And it was at the age of 27, I began studying to be a minister. Some of you know the story, some find it a hair sinister. I was a bona fide rock star on a tour of Australia. I had a vision of a burning plane. Had it not been for a couple of angels taking the strain on the wings, we'd have been goners. I know it seems far-fetched, but I give you my word of honor, I saw what I saw. It was 1957, the same year Sputnik was launched and orbited the Earth. Some people are quite staunch in their belief it was Sputnik I saw. Jerry Lee Lewis released Great Balls of Fire that same year. Some think that's what inspired my vision. At any rate, I cancelled the rest of my tour and flew home early. I'd had enough of the hurly-burly. Now, here's the thing. The original flight on which I'd been booked, went down in flames over the Pacific. I'd been spared. It was at that specific moment I knew God was real. It was at that moment I knew we claim victory only when we kneel. It was at that moment I knew we take control only when we give ourselves over to something. It might be rock and roll. It might be St. Peter on his rock. It doesn't mean everything's a matter of fate. It doesn't mean every door is locked. We don't have to stick with the flight in which we were booked. So I'd like to dedicate this song to the memory of Rayshard Brooks. He reminds us that we may actively stop choosing to raise the color bar every time a black man happens to be found asleep in a car at a Wendy's drive-through. We may stop saying we'll think about that later every time there's a drive-by shooting at a drive-in movie theater. And that's a coup for a song. You needed that gun against the mescalero. You needed that gun against their bows and arrows. You needed that gun when they asked for your papers. You needed that gun when Aunt Rhody had the vapors. You needed that gun against the Caped Crusader. You needed that gun against the other Tomb Raider. There's been a drive-by shooting at the drive-in movie theater. There's been a drive-by shooting at the drive-in movie theater. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. And I think we'll hand you over now shortly to Francine Prose.
All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my video back up here. Give me 1 second. All right. Thank you so much, Paul. That was lovely. We will hear more from you in just a moment. So we'll say goodbye for now. And our next writer up tonight is Francine Prose. Francine is the author of 21 works of fiction, including the highly acclaimed Mr. Monkey, A Changed Man, which won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and Blue Angel, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her works of nonfiction include the highly praised Anne Frank, the book, The Life, The Afterlife, and the New York Times bestseller, Reading Like a Writer, which has become a classic. The recipient of numerous grants and honors, including a Guggenheim and a Fulbright, a Director's Fellow at the Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, Prose is a former president of Penn American Center and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is a distinguished writer in residence at Bard College. So please welcome Francine Prose. Hi, Francine.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I cannot wait to hear what you have to read for us. So take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren, and thank all of you. And I'm so pleased to be here, and it's an honor to read with Paul. And I also want to thank the great Roger Rosenblatt for putting all this together. So thank you, Roger. I'm going to read from my novel. It's my new novel, The Vixen. It's so new that it's not even born yet. It's kind of a prenatal novel, I guess you could say. It's coming out at the end of June 29th. So this is the quite beautiful cover. And what you may or may not be able to see is this couple here clasped in a passionate embrace. are Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed for allegedly spying for Russia in 1953. So that's the background of the novel, which takes place in 1953, 1954. The book begins with a prologue, which happens on the night of the Rosenberg execution. And my hero, narrator Simon, is at home with his parents. He's recently graduated from college. He's at home with his parents in Coney Island in Brooklyn, watching the Rosenberg execution on television. It was more or less televised. And as they're watching, the news from the Sing Sing prison keeps being interrupted by various TV sitcoms from the 50s. So, and then the first real chapter, which I'm going to read from, I'm going to read a very brief section from this chapter, and then a very brief selection from the end. Takes place again in 1954, and it's sort of the beginning of the plot. In the winter of 1954, I was assigned to edit a novel, The Vixen, The Patriot, and The Fanatic, a steamy bodice ripper based on the Rosenberg case. The previous year, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed for allegedly selling atomic secrets to the Russians. The horror of the electric chair and the chance that the couple were innocent had ignited outrage in this country and abroad. Protesters took to the streets in sympathy for the sweet-faced housewife whose only crime may have been typing a document for her brother, David Greenglass. But according to the manuscript that landed on my desk, the Rosenbergs, in the novel The Rosensteins, were communist traitors, guilty of espionage and treason, eager to soak their hands in the blood of the millions who would die because of their crime. The Vixen, The Patriot, and The Fanatic, Anya Partridge's debut novel, portrayed the Rosensteins as cold-blooded spies masterminding a vast conspiracy to destroy the American way of life. Esther Rosenstein was a calculating seductress, an amoral Matahari who used her beauty and her irresistible sex appeal to dominate her impotent husband and lure a string of powerful men into putting the free world at risk of nuclear Armageddon. It was strange that I, of all the young editors in New York, should have been chosen to work on that book. My mother grew up on the Lower East Side, in the same tenement building as Ethel Greenglass then. They went to the same high school. They hadn't been close, but history had turned Ethel in my mother's eyes into a beloved friend, almost a family member, a victim of state-sanctioned public murder. Perhaps my mother's sympathy was unconsciously spiked by our natural human desire for proximity to the famous. My being assigned the Vixen was, I thought, pure coincidence. No one at work knew about the family connection. The only person who bridged the distant worlds of home and office was my uncle, Madison Putnam, the distinguished literary critic and public intellectual who had used his influence to arrange my job. If he knew that his sister-in-law had been Ethel's neighbor and classmate, he would never have said so. Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, was still conducting investigations accusing people of being communists plotting to destroy our freedom. There were no trials, only hearings. McCarthy was the prosecutor, judge, and jury. To be accused was to be convicted. Once you appeared before the committee, your friends and coworkers shunned you. Most likely you lost your job. There were betrayals, divorces, suicides, early deaths brought on by panic about the future. Refusing to cooperate with the investigation could mean contempt citations and prison. You didn't mention someone you knew in the same sentence as a Russian spy. You definitely didn't admit that your mother or wife or sister-in-law grew up with the woman who committed the crime of the century. Those were not celebrities whose names anyone dropped, not unless you wanted the FBI knocking on your door. A tawdry romance loosely based on the Rosenberg cakes. The Vixen, the Patriot, and the Fanatic was intended to be an international bestseller. It was not the sort of book that would normally ever appear under the imprint of the distinguished firm of Landry, and Bartlett. Landry, and Bartlett published literary fiction, historical biographies, and poetry collections, mostly by established poets. The company was founded just after the Second World War, though it seemed to have been fashioned after an older, more venerable model, a long-established family firm. Since the retirement of its ailing co-founder Preston Bartlett III, one heard rumors, whispers, really, that its finances were shaky and its future uncertain, rumors that my uncle seemed delighted to pass on. The hope was that the money the Vixen generated might allow us to continue to publish the serious literature for which we were known and respected, and which rarely turned a profit. It was made clear to me that publishing a purely commercial second-rate novel was a devil's bargain, but we had no choice. It was a bargain and a choice that our director, Warren Landry, was willing to make. Perhaps this is the point to say that at that time my life seemed to me to have been built on a series of lies. Not flat-out lies, but lies of omission, withheld information, uncorrected misunderstandings. Many young people feel this way. Some people feel it all their lives. The first lie was the lie of my name. Simon Putnam wasn't the name of a Jewish guy from Coney Island. It was the name of a Puritan preacher condemning Jewish guys from Coney Island to eternal hellfire and damnation. My father's last name, my last name, was the prank of an immigration official who, on Thanksgiving Day, in honor of the holiday, gave each new arrival, among them my grandfather, the surname of a Mayflower pilgrim. Since then, I've met other descendants of immigrants who landed in Boston during the brief tenure of the patriotic customs officer. Brodsky became Bradstreet, DePelo became Page, Maslin became Mather. Welcome to America. I hadn't, or maybe I had intended to compound these misapprehensions by writing what turned out to be my Harvard admissions essay about the great Puritan sermon, Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered in Massachusetts in 1741. I wrote about Edwards' faith that God wanted him to terrify his congregation by describing the vengeance that the deity planned to take on the wicked, unbelieving Israelites. It seemed unnecessary to mention that I was one of the sinners whom God planned to throw into the fire. I was afraid that my personal relation to the material might appear to skew my reading of this literary masterpiece. Okay, so the end, I'm going to read the end, spoiler alert. After having been through many trials of the conscience and spirit, my hero is happily married. He's got 2 children, and much of the novel takes place in Coney Island, as does the last scene, which I think is self-explanatory. Oh, except that the narrator and his father both have a horror of the parachute jump, which I guess is no longer operative, but was at the time in Coney Island. The Wonder Wheel, the Tilt-A-Whirl, the Steeplechase, the Aeroplano, each ride had a minimum height and age the children had to reach in order to ride it. We mostly stuck to the rules with our kids, though if they really wanted to go on a ride, we added a year and an inch, a harmless little lie that made us all feel closer, outlaws and rebels together. When Evan was 10 and 5'2", the legal age and height, he asked to go on the parachute jump. He'd been asking for years, and at last I agreed. I'd been hearing they were about to shut it down because of safety concerns. That should have made us stay away, but instead it made it seem urgent. I thought about my father's warnings with detached bemusement. How ironic it would be if Dad turned out to be right. Evan and I were strapped in together, and we were hoisted up. I concentrated on not seeming scared for my son's sake. I focused on breathing steadily. My boy was excited and happy. They kept us at the top for a while to ramp up the fear and excitement. People were already screaming, and their terror edged into my consciousness like someone opening an envelope with the tip of a knife. I wish I told Julia I loved her more. I wish I'd kissed my daughter. I couldn't see them from the air. It was the middle of July, and the heat made the streets wobble and shimmer beneath us. Julia had thought the ride was dangerous. She'd been angry at me for doing something stupid. She'd whisked Aurelia off to get something to eat and spare our child the sight of her father and brother falling from the sky. Why hadn't I listened to Julia? Why hadn't I believed my father? Goodbye, I thought. goodbye. But once we started our descent, I never doubted that things were under control, that we would land safely, that our parachute would open. We were weightless, deep in the ocean, looking up through jellyfish at the sun. I held my son against me, his spine and rib cage pressed into my chest, his bones as fragile as a bird's. I felt as if I'd scooped up a baby bird fallen from its nest. A baby bird fallen from its nest, the fear came back. I'd made a mistake. Because I gave in, because I'd ignored my instincts and intuition, because I'd forgotten my father's warnings, because I hadn't listened to my wife, because I'd wanted my son to think I was braver than I was, because of one reckless act, my son and I were going to die. Julia would never get over it, Aurelia would grow up without me. I prayed to whatever was out there. Shorter are the prayers in midair, but more heartfelt. I prayed that if we landed safely, that after all this ended, after we'd plummeted through the air and floated down onto the ground, that if my son and I could just stand and brush ourselves off and go back to our ordinary lives, if we could just go on living, just this once, this day, this hour, if we could be allowed to keep what we had, just this, no more or less, then I promised that someday I would write, as honestly as I could, the true story of the year when Ethel Rosenberg died, and I so desperately wanted to save her. I promised the parachute that opened. I promised the sky that let us go. I promised the earth that heard my prayer and rose up to receive us. Thanks. Paul.
Hey, how are you? Lovely to see you. Well, that was fabulous. And how did you get into that story? I mean, had you thought about the Rosenbergs over the years, or did something in particular set you off on that inquiry? Or is inquiry the right word? Do you think of a novel as an inquiry? I'm asking two questions at once, which is a terrible mistake.
Let me try and just answer whichever one I can remember. My mother, I thought about them all my life. My mother actually grew up with Ethel Rosenberg. So this is, even though no one would imagine that this novel has anything to do with me, it is the most autobiographical. So she was very much a figure in our family's life when I was growing up. And I remember very clearly the night of the execution. So yeah, and then I tried to write it for years and years and years. And in fact, I have on my computer 14 very long false starts. And then somehow, you know how it happens. You try and fail and try and fail and try and fail better. And then something else happens. So let me ask you, the frogs. I mean, how did you decide on that?
Well, actually, I really didn't decide on it myself at all. I found myself involved with a group of songwriters who occasionally get together and dedicate themselves to writing a song a day for a week. And I decided that I would use this as an opportunity just to try to write something that might survive beyond the week. I mean, I suppose that's one of the things that keeps us going as writers. And so anyway, I found myself getting into it. And so I didn't expect to do it. And before I knew it, had done it. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Aristophanes. I did have a go a few years ago at translating with a bona fide Greek scholar, the birds, or birds as it's known sometimes. And so anyway, it just happened to get into it. I find myself that for the most part, I consider myself very lucky if things creep up on me and take me by surprise, in fact, and I don't expect anything actually really to happen at all. I mean, you talk about your 14 false starts. I assume that getting the start right is really critical, getting the angle of entry into the atmosphere of the planet that is a novel. I think has got to be vital. I mean, I actually encourage my students to spend as much time as they possibly can on the first line of their poem. And, you know, before they do anything, try to get it right. They may never quite get it right. None of us may ever quite get it right. But that's where the time is spent, I think. And I assume it might be, even since so much more is at stake in some ways with a longer piece of prose, the same might be true for yourself.
Well, I couldn't. What finally made it possible was that I realized here was this family watching the execution, and that like Ozzie and Harriet and the Lucille Ball show kept intruding on the tragedy. So somehow when that came to me, and I wrote it sort of in strange. Well, can we be perfectly honest? There were only, you know,
I hope so.
Okay,
hope so.
I was in California. I was visiting a friend in California, and one of my friends brought over this pack of edibles, you know, THC edibles, and I didn't know how many to take, so I just ate a bunch of them, and suddenly it all became clear. And I sat down at my friend's dining room table, and I went, just figured out how to do this, chemically altered, however it was.
That was
and it, you know, it just, well, you know how it is. Once you start, and once you're right, you get that beginning, it just kind of falls into place like a bunch of dominoes or something. I don't know. And then the rest of it just spun out after that.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was a word from our sponsors, in case you were wondering what that was. So listen, you know, one of the Write America, WRITE, of course, for the punsters among us, hard not to read it as having somehow having to do with America perhaps getting itself back on track. I mean, I think we did sign on, as it were, to say a word or two about that. Of course, we could just keep talking about the opening of a novel or a poem for the rest of our time. But what about
the frogs?
The frogs? Yeah, I mean, how do things look to you these days, or this day? I mean, this is Monday, I guess. Tomorrow's a big day.
Tomorrow's a big day. Yeah, well, things feel better than they did 6 weeks ago. That's for sure. I mean, you know, but I also think I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think that we're that we've been through a kind of collective trauma, all of us. I mean, between COVID and the election and the Capitol, you know, insurrection, and that we're all like trauma survivors in a certain way, and we're putting things back together or recovering as best we can. And you know, I feel very fortunate to be able to write at all, just to, you know, I mean, I hate the idea of writing as therapy, but but distraction is certainly therapy, and it's a great distraction. So yeah, how do you think about it, Paul?
Well, I mean, I have to be optimistic about it. There is much much that we perhaps may not be optimistic about, but I certainly believe that we're on a better track in terms of what's happening in the White House. I mean, I have concerns about how Joe Biden and indeed the rest of us are indeed going to be able to reconcile ourselves with essentially 1 and 2 Americans. I mean, it was a very close run thing. Biden won, but it was a close run thing. 1 and 2 Americans essentially somehow believe that Trump should be our president, and that's something that I suppose I find it hard to fathom, really.
Yeah, it is hard to fathom. But you know, again, when I was writing this book during the Trump era, I felt that I was sort of plunged into the middle of an era that was not so unlike ours, and then when McCarthy was brought down by Joseph Welch, saying, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" et cetera, et cetera. But what frightened me, even at that point, was the idea that the word decency had lost its currency, and that wouldn't work now. I mean, one thing that was interesting to me was that everyone thinks that that was sort of a spontaneous moment that Joseph Welch came up with, but apparently he'd been rehearsing this for weeks, and just went into the McCarthy hearings and used, well, what weaponized the idea of decency as a way of restoring order to the country. I don't know. I don't know how that would work now, or what would be the magic word that would do the same thing, or if there is one, or so forth. I think I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, at my more optimistic moments, I think, well, it's going to be a slow process, and it's going to depend on the people who feel that they've been forgotten, beginning to feel that they're remembered again, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I hope we can figure it out. As you talk about the 50s and McCarthyism, the Russians. I mean, I sort of had felt for a few years there that we'd moved beyond the Russian situation. We clearly have not. I want to ask you a question, though. In broad terms, do you think that history is cyclical?
Yeah, I do. But I don't know, I was talking about this the other day. It's cyclical, but then there's this kind of wild card. I mean, a friend of mine asked me just a couple of days ago what I thought about evil, the existence of evil and so forth. And I think, I mean, I've always thought that there's this sort of bouncing ball theory of evil. I mean, that is, it just bounces, it goes to Germany in the 30s and 40s, it goes to Cambodia, it goes to Rwanda, and so forth. And for a while, it seemed like it was gaining some momentum to bounce here. And my hope is that I don't know that it just bounces away and doesn't. But again, I think it's this constant threat to make wherever you are an inhospitable situation for that ball of evil to land in. So I don't know. What do you think about the cyclical?
Well, I mean, I must say that for a long time, I thought it was a slightly fanciful idea. One that was certainly central to the work of a couple of my compatriots on the scribbling front. And of course, I'm thinking of Yeats and Joyce, both of whom had a sense that history moves in cycles. And I suppose at some level, I thought, well, that's the sort of stuff that's kind of, that's really just Vico, or it's fanciful. It's not really how things work. But I'm beginning to wonder if, in fact, it's not somewhat accurate. When we see the cycles of, for example, I've just been thinking about something happening in the 1920s, racial unrest, and in the late teens and 20s, racial unrest. I mean, when are we going to break out of that cycle? I suppose is one of the questions that besets us, and the notion of racial justice, which I must say I was very. I thought over the summer I was really delighted to see people on the streets, the Black Lives Matter protests. But that I don't know if I get a sense, and maybe I'm just wrong in this, that may have lost a little bit of momentum. Do you have a sense of that yourself? Maybe there are things happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, but I thought that was a great moment, and it does seem to have dissipated a little bit.
Well, I mean, it's out of the streets, but I think that it's I don't think you can get through a day without thinking about it. And I think it's, I mean, I do think it was very successful at raising our awareness of the ongoing horror of systemic racism, and whatever. There's no negative to thinking more about that and to trying to correct that and so forth. I mean, it's incredibly important. But I mean, just for a moment, I want to talk about when you were talking about Aristophanes, about reading the classics. I mean, I think that really persuades you that history is cyclical. Because I've been reading Plutarch lately. That's how I've been passing this part of the pandemic. I've been reading Plutarch and Suetonius, and so many of the situations they describe seem so contemporary and so recognizable to me that I think, well, that was what 2,000 years ago, and human beings are behaving as well or as badly as they were back then. So there's something, there are flaws in the design of human nature, and there are great things in the design of human nature that don't seem to have changed that much, for better or worse.
I suppose that one advance we might point to is, we're not quite there yet, but I am astonished, really, by the speed with which these various companies have developed vaccines. Whatever we might say about Plutarch and Suetonius, that's not something they had their heads around.
I know they didn't even know. I mean, thousands of people died and no one knew why. It's like
right. So, I mean, the fact that we are able to have some kind of a toe hold or a nail hold or whatever it is on that is very heartening. And, I just, it's wonderful that as human beings, that we are able to do that however little control we have over things, in the end of the day, we actually have developed to a point where we can have a little more sway that we don't always use in the way that we might or the way that we should.
Yeah. I mean, a friend told me that we, that is, she's the same age as, we're the last generation to be vaccinated for smallpox, that had been eradicated, absolutely eradicated. And then, of course, there's a vial of it in some labs here in Russia, but that it's gone. And if anything can make you believe in the power of science for the good, things like that are extremely persuasive. And now the fact that we have a vaccine.
I'm of a certain age. When I was a kid, people were very conscious of tuberculosis. TB was being talked about constantly. Polio in the 1950s,
oh, I know,
brought up, was a huge thing. The various diseases that assail us, in a way, are quite normal. And the fact that we went for a few years there, many of us in a particular bubble, in the various so-called advanced countries, were not perhaps so much touched by this, was really not necessarily extraordinary. It was not. That was not the norm. That was the extraordinary.
Yeah. Although, once again, the inequities. I mean, it's still happening. That I can't remember the figure, but it's staggering. Numbers of people are dying from malaria in the less privileged countries in the world, and that's like, whatever, it's happening there and not here. So we've once again marshaled forces to preserve us and Europe and so forth. But there are places where kids are dying of malaria, and we just let it happen, or the our so-called civilization lets it happen. So there's
Right.
there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, and
Right. A lot of
all you can hope.
lot of big issues here, Francine. I doubt if we're going, we may touch on some of them. I doubt if we're going to solve them this evening.
Hi, Laura.
Hi. Sorry to interrupt, but I do want to take some questions. We have quite a few. And before we do that, I see that there are quite a few of our writers from Write America participating in the chat tonight. Adrian Unger is here, Major Jackson, Rita Dove, Jackie and John.
Hi, guys.
Hilma Wallitzer, they're all here. So thank you for tuning in. I think Julie Sheehan, Paul, wants you to give some of your Francine's edibles to your students to see how that first line in their poems turn out.
I want to hold on to my job, I think.
Yeah.
It might be a good idea.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
They'll find it on their own too.
All right. Well, let's start. I have a question for you both. Can you think of an experience that you had early on where you learned that language had power?
Francine?
I'm trying to think. It's a great question, but Paul, take this one.
One that comes to mind, actually, that poem that I read earlier, two things I mentioned very briefly. That poem that I read earlier on was called Anshaw, the Irish word for here. Where I was brought up in Northern Ireland, and to some extent this is, alas, still true, the Irish language is associated with the Catholic nationalist population. It's not part of the official vocabulary, as it's not. It happens in many cases, or at least back in the 1950s. In many cases, it happened under the radar, so that when we were having the roll called in the morning in school, and we answered Anshaw, there was a frisson about that. It was as if we were actually operating, maybe even at some level, against the powers that be, flying in the face of the state of Northern Ireland. And so there was that sense that language is powerful, and that a word can get you killed, that a pronunciation in Northern Ireland is still the case on how you pronounce the letter H, or is it H? And there are situations certainly where depending on the context, mispronouncing that letter could probably still get you killed. I wouldn't be surprised. The other thing, of course, was I was brought up as a Catholic, and I was an altar boy. I was just thinking about it as it happens this morning. I heard from somebody with whom I was an altar boy, whatever, 65 years ago. And, the power of the Latin Mass, just as a force, which we didn't necessarily understand, the power of that language and the institution that lay behind it was very, very big in our lives, and that language, I think, was very powerful. But anyway, I'm blathering on, Francine.
No, I'm glad you are, because I guess my only sense of that was the way in which words on the page. I mean, very early on, I discovered that they could take me from wherever I was and take me someplace else, which was a huge blessing. I mean, I had a perfectly nice family, but I was a kid. I didn't want to be around them. And I opened a book and I was gone. And, so now I have to write them.
All right. Let me see. Have you read anything that made you think differently about fiction or poetry? If so, what was it?
Well, good question. I mean, every novel that I read or a poem that I read that I really like makes me think differently about fiction and poetry. And in a way, I mean, the more and more the works of literature that I'm most drawn to are the ones that make me think, gee, I didn't know you could do that. I just didn't know that you could do that. I mean, my big discovery of the fall was Amos Tutuola's "My Life in the Bush of Goats," which was written in the 50s. Have you read this, Paul? Do you know? Oh my God! It's the most amazing. It's the most amazing book ever because it's written his own. It's written in English. He was Nigerian. It's not patois. It's some other language. All his word choices are slightly off, but they're better than normal word choices. And I mean, every chapter you're going like, oh my God, how did he possibly think that he could get away with doing what he's doing in this chapter? So, so books like that.
Yeah, I think that's true of many writers for whom English is not necessarily their first language. It's true of Conrad, for example. It's true of Stoppard. And I actually, just to think of two, and I myself, to go back to your question, I suppose I would say that I have no idea what prose fiction is or what poetry or verse. I don't really have any particular, I hope anyway, positions on them. And like Francine, every poem I read, it's at its best, will actually change how you think about things, will change how you think about the world, actually. To go back to the question about the power of language, that is one of the extraordinary effects that language has. It's connected to the world, it comes from the world, of course, but it also has us reconfigure the world just by changing the order of a few words. I mean, we're talking about actually a few words. However big one's vocabulary might be, it's these permutations on a few words that allow these extraordinary moments of insight and revelation in the world. So anyway, yeah.
All right. Let me see. If you could tell your younger writer self anything, what would it be?
What's that thing that Betty Davis says in All About Eve? Fasten your seatbelts, honey. We're in for a bumpy ride.
Was that Betty Davis?
Wasn't it? Was it?
I thought that was Mae West, but maybe it was Betty Davis. Yes.
Somebody, one of them says it. That's what I would tell That's what I would tell my younger self.
I like that a lot. Now, Francine, this one is from you. For you, this is from Bill. Francine, delighted to know of your novel about the Rosenbergs. I recently rewatched Angels in America. Do you have any comments on that portrayal of Ethel and of Roy Cohn?
Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn. I mean, speaking of the existence of evil in the world, I mean, Roy Cohn is the link because Roy Cohn, of course, the lawyer, was McCarthy's right-hand guy. He was his advisor. You see him. He's in Angels in America. I mean, you see him first. In Angels in America, he's denying the fact that he was gay, even as he was dying of AIDS. Blah blah blah. And then he was Donald Trump's mentor. He was the one who said to Donald Trump, the famous quote from, I think, Goebbels, if you repeat a lie 3 times, it becomes true. He was the one who taught Donald Trump how to operate in the world. So here's this bridge between, the nightmare of McCarthyism and the nightmare of Trumpism. And it goes straight through in the horrible presence of Roy Cohn. So yeah.
This one's another one from Bill. He's killing it with these questions. Paul, is the pandemic isolation time ironically a good time for poets, in your opinion?
Well, I think some kind of isolation is, I think, part of the deal for most artists, or at least maybe not for musicians so much, for some of them, but I'm using artists. So I think for many writers, their lives have really not changed all that substantially in terms of how they get through the day. I mean, this is not to say that none of this is at any, it's had no impact on people. Of course it has. But, I'm a person myself. I get up at 5 a.m. or 6 o'clock or whatever, and I kind of sit there all day, and, I'm only writing a few wee poems. And certainly if one is writing a novel, you kind of have to put in a few hours, not all day, a few hours at least, just to cover the canvas. And so in that sense, it's, I understand that some writers, I think, have found it very difficult. I think it varies from person to person. But I think for many of us, I wouldn't want to say it's more of the same, but it's less of a break than one might imagine, I think, for many. Francine, does that make any sense? Or does sound terribly crass?
No, my life hasn't changed all that much, although it was better when it was voluntary. I mean, the isolation, I would like to be able to choose, etc. But, and also, I mean, there's something about the horror of it that does seep in all the time, that it takes a kind of effort to just, stay focused, really, and not just spiral into whatever.
Now, Francine, I have another one for you. This one's from Brendan Costello. He says, Francine, your description of the framing of the vixen and your personal connection with the Rosenbergs reminds him a bit of Don DeLillo's novel Libra about Lee Harvey Oswald. Did that novel or any other modern historically focused works affect your approach to the vixen?
Oh, what a good question. I hadn't thought about it. I mean, I admire Don DeLillo and Libra tremendously. So, I mean, it's a great example because in a way, anytime you're doing anything that doesn't take place at the present moment, you want to, you don't want to make mistakes, anachronisms that just throw the reader around. I mean, what was it? I used the phrase, what was it, Death Star or something. And my son said, you know what? That was not in usage until the Star Wars movies. So get that out of there. It was so because that sort of thing throws the reader up. But on the other hand, you don't, want to do something that feels that it's so bogged down with research to give yourself credibility that it's just, an example of how much research you've done. Because
I'll tell you, it certainly didn't feel like that. I felt that you were really, I was in there with you from what you read. And I loved the way it sort of went from the big picture, as it were, with the Rosenbergs and to the speakers, let's say the protagonists' engagement with it. I thought it was really lovely, if I may be so bold.
Thank you.
As to say that. Yeah, but I can imagine, I mean, even for poetry, of course, even for poetry, one has to do a little bit of research, or perhaps even a lot of research, actually. But I think probably, as they say, you have to do all this research and then forget about it or make it seem as if you haven't really done it at all, or some version of that, perhaps.
Yeah, well, having a terrible memory, a deteriorating memory loss, it's a blessing sometimes.
Yeah, well, I have a real problem with that. And one of my issues is that I have come up with a absolutely fabulous idea for a poem. Unbelievable, unbelievably extraordinarily brilliant. And kind of written, maybe even written it, only to discover that sometime earlier I had the same fabulous idea. I'd completely forgotten about it. You know,
it happens. The other version of that is writing down the fabulous idea and then realizing that you can't read your handwriting. That happens to me quite often.
Right. Those are the really fabulous ideas.
I know. Who had this fabulous idea?
This one is from Charlie. Paul, many of your poems draw together seemingly disparate ideas and pieces of information in such surprising, marvelous, fruitful ways. I'm curious how you think about this. Is there an element of surprise in these combinations for you too?
Totally. I mean, the answer. Thank you so much for your comment. And I mean, I suppose that's actually one of the reasons why I, and I'm sure Francine and many others are in this business at all, is to you know, is to be in a place where you simply did not expect to be, and have things happening to you that you simply did not expect. So basically, it all comes as a surprise to me. And I mean, I work on the I never really know what I'm doing, and I work on the principle that if I don't know what I'm doing, you know, maybe something interesting will happen. Because actually, if I were to know what I was doing, I know enough about myself to know that nothing interesting will happen. So it's really only from accepting that you're giving yourself over to it, you know, something beyond yourself that with a wee bit of luck will bring you to an interesting place.
Fascinating. This is another one from Bill. Paul, do you see the present USA armed rightists who stormed the U.S. Capitol as similar to the Provosts?
You know, I actually can't say to what extent they would be similar to the Provosts. The Provosts are the provisional IRA, of course, that Bill Navins is referring to. And certainly they were described and are generally thought of as terrorists. One man's freedom fighter, as you know very well, is another person's terrorist. And you know, these are ideas that certainly are going to be engaging all of us in this part of the world for a while, I'd say, as to how exactly we might describe them. You know, the term terrorist seems to be widely used of them, for sure. They, of course, don't think of themselves as terrorists, which is not to say that they don't. But the fact that they don't think of themselves as such is actually quite a big question that really has to be teased out. I mean, that's a big problem. You know, it's a problem of that the society has to figure out.
All righty. Francine, lovely reading. This is Bill again. Are you aware?
Bill, if you know home to go to.
He's just got a lot of questions. Good ones, too. Francine, lovely reading. Are you aware of the good work of the Rosenberg Fund for the Children set up by the Mirapoles, the sons of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg?
Well, yeah. I mean, also Ivy Mirapole, the granddaughter of Ethel and Julius, is a filmmaker who's made a marvelous full-length documentary about the Rosenbergs, and also a great full-length documentary about Roy Cohn. So, and in fact, my editor told me that Michael Mirapole had asked for a copy of an advanced copy of the novel. So I'm curious to hear what they think about it.
All righty. And we have a question from Nick Flynn. He's one of our authors. He submitted one last week that was a doozy. So I think he's going a little bit easier on you guys this week.
Thank you, Nick.
This one could be for either of you. How do you get to that place of unknowing that Paul mentioned as necessary to the poem?
Well, I think one first of all has to accept that it is a place from which interesting things might come. And there are ways that one may get there. I myself am a big fan of a little book or a big book, depending on which side of the bed you get out of in the morning, called Zen and the Art of Archery, which is by a German philosopher called Jürgen Herigel, who goes off to study with a Japanese master archer who can hit the target blindfold, who can hit it in pitch darkness. How does he do that? How on earth does he do that? And the master gradually allows him to understand that only when he accepts that it shoots and it hits, he says, that's at last, he says, at last the bowstring has cut through you. And there are ways of getting to that place. They demand a lot of humility. With my students, I often try to get them there initially with versions of Exquisite Corpse, that game where one has a single line on a piece of paper, then someone responds to that line, that's turned over, someone responds to the next line, right? Exquisite Corpse from the visual arts tradition of the head from one realm and the torso from another and the legs from another. And what's extraordinary about it is that actually the language itself, as one line responds to another, very interesting connections are made, and they're made totally randomly, totally serendipitously, but to be able to go to the random and honor the the serendipitous, and not to feel right that at least not to feel that one is in charge of what one's doing. One doesn't leave one's mind outside the door, but to go to that place where ignorance resides, decent ignorance, and to be able to admit to it, which is something that we don't really do much in this culture. Anyway, Francine, does this mean anything to you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my favorite quote about this question is it was in a documentary about the great painter Philip Gustav, and he was talking about going into his studio, and he said, when you first go into your studio, everybody's in your head, your wife, your kids, your dealer, your public. He said, and as you start to work, one by one, they leave the room. They leave your head. Your wife leaves the room, your kids, your dealer, your critic, the public. He said, and then if you're really working, you leave the room. Right? I mean, even though you're still there.
Totally.
So, and I mean, one of the great things about writing fiction is that you're not you. You're somebody else. I mean, it's becoming someone else. And it's a real pleasure for me because, I don't know about other people, but I get sick of being me after a certain amount of time. And the joy of just being inside someone else's skin is huge. And it's, being willing to let go of what you think and your own attitudes and your own prejudices and your own past, and just becoming another person, seeing the world through that person. I
totally agree with you. It's not a universally held idea, of course, but it's certainly one I hold.
Let me see. Okay. Now, this one is for Paul. Do you encourage students to work on the first line of a poem before they write the second line, or do they revise the early draft of that first line several times?
I do, and I know that it seems a little difficult I think, often to take in. I do encourage them to write one line at a time. I mean, it's an idea that in the abstract, it sounds a bit odd, but I work on the principle, and I encourage them to think about how one thing leads to another, really. And you know, if one's involved in a piece of construction, which is how I think writing, it's one way I think about writing, talking about ignorance and all the rest of it. But there are other components involved too. And so I encourage them to spend as much time as they possibly can on getting the tone of that first, in terms of vocabulary, point of view, whether or not it's ironized, who's speaking it, because that's an invention too, even if it's a speaker who is by and large indivisible from the historical personage whose name is at the foot of the page. So I do encourage them to do that, and needless to say, in the verse business, where line 1 ends and line 2 begins is also a very critical thing. So it's hard to think about line 1 without beginning to think about line 2. So I encourage what you might call a slow poetry movement. I've never really thought about it in those terms, but it's like, slowing down. And of course, people are worried that their great idea that we were talking about earlier on is going to somehow evanesce and disappear. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't even exist as yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, speaking of first lines, Megan has a question for Francine. She was very intrigued with the idea of getting that first line right so that it sets the stage for the rest of the work. So she asks, Francine, may we hear the first sentence from your novel? And do you think that you got it right?
I have to think I got it right. At this point, ask me 6 months from now. First line of the novel, the shades are drawn, the apartment dark, except for the lunar glow from the kitchen and in the living room, the flicker of the 12-inch black and white screen. Mm-hmm. So that, reasonably straightforward, but that's like 50 drafts into what it, to make it what it is.
But it's Paul approved?
Yeah, definitely.
What's he going to say? No?
But go back to the drawing board.
I think you know me well enough to know that I would say no. No, I think that works well.
All right. Well, I think that this is a good place to end it. I want to thank you both so much for being here tonight. And thank you to everybody who tuned in, our audience members and some of our authors too. And of course, a big, big thank you to Roger Rosenblatt, the man who dreamed this whole thing up. I'm so glad that he did, because I wouldn't get to meet fabulous authors like you guys and spend, an hour of my evening every Monday night until September with fantastic writers. So thank you, Roger. Again, thank you, Francine. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Roger.
And don't forget, everybody watching, click this button down here, go to bookreview.com and purchase some signed copies of Francine and Paul's books. So we will see you next week with Russell Banks, Major Jackson, and Alice McDermott. Bye.
Fabulous.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.